3 cardboard boxes sat blocking the narrow hallway. My heavy winter coats were spilling over the edges. Their sleeves dragged like dead weight across the scuffed hardwood floor. It was Tuesday afternoon. The air outside was heavy with that brutal South Philly humidity. But the chill inside this cramped brick row house was absolute. My husband David had been gone for exactly 6 hours. His long-haul rig was already somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. He was completely out of cell service and entirely unreachable. I stood in the entryway with 2 heavy plastic grocery bags biting into my wrists. The canned goods I had just bought with my own meager earnings from the tailor shop weighed me down. I stared at the boxes, my mind struggling to process the visual. My favorite blue sweater rested on top of a pile of old jeans. Someone had violently shoved my entire life into leftover shipping boxes. A floorboard creaked above my head. The sound of heavy footsteps descended the narrow wooden staircase. It was Brittany. David's younger sister paused on the 3rd step, looking down at me with cold, dead eyes. She chewed on a piece of gum slowly, the loud smacks echoing in the suffocating silence of the hallway. She did not offer an explanation. She simply crossed her arms over her chest and told me I had exactly 14 days to get my trash out of her house. I dropped the grocery bags. A glass jar of pasta sauce shattered against the floorboards, sending thick red liquid pooling around the base of the boxes. I asked her what she thought she was doing. My voice trembled, echoing off the peeling wallpaper of the claustrophobic corridor. She smiled. It was a thin, joyless expression that did not reach her eyes. She stepped right into the puddle of sauce, utterly unbothered, and leaned in close to my face. She whispered that I was nothing but a squatter. She reminded me, dripping with venom, that my name was nowhere on the deed to this property. The house belonged to David and their mother Eleanor, split 50-50 after their father passed away. Brittany legally owned nothing, but she moved through these cramped rooms with the absolute entitlement of a queen defending her castle. I looked past her shoulder. At the top of the stairs, a shadow shifted in the dim light. It was Eleanor. My mother-in-law stood there in her faded floral housecoat, her frail hands gripping the wooden banister. She had witnessed the entire exchange. She had seen her daughter pack my belongings like garbage. I called out to her, begging for her to intervene, for her to tell Brittany to stop this madness. Eleanor's tired eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. Then she looked away. Without a single word, she turned and retreated down the dark upstairs hallway. Her bedroom door clicked shut. A moment later, the muffled sound of a daytime television game show filtered through the thin walls. She had turned the volume up to drown out the conflict. I was utterly alone. The isolation crashed over me like a physical blow. I pulled my phone from my pocket and frantically typed a message to David, begging him to call me the second he found a signal. I hit send, but the screen only displayed a spinning gray circle. Delivery failed. Brittany laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound. She told me to go ahead and cry to her brother, reminding me that he would not be back for 3 long weeks. She kicked one of my boxes out of her way and walked toward the kitchen. She left me standing in the broken glass and spilled sauce. My hands shook as I knelt down to start picking up the mess. I reached into the first cardboard box to move my sweaters away from the spreading red stain. As I pulled the heavy wool aside, something fluttered to the floor. It was a piece of crisp white paper, folded into perfect thirds. It had not fallen from my pockets. It had been dropped in the rush to pack my things. I picked it up and unfolded it. The heavy parchment paper felt expensive between my fingers. At the bottom of the page was a dark blue notary stamp. Beside it were long columns of numbers. Tens of thousands of dollars spelled out in dense, Lega font. Before I could read the header, a violent force struck my shoulder. Brittany slammed into me, knocking me back against the plaster wall. She snatched the paper from my hands with vicious speed. Her face was entirely drained of color, her dark eyes wide with a sudden, frantic panic. She shoved the folded document into her back pocket and screamed at me to never touch her private things again. She was breathing heavily, a stark contrast to her usual calculated calm. I asked her what those numbers were. I demanded to know what she was hiding. She bared her teeth and told me to mind my own business, or my 14 days would turn into 14 minutes. She turned on her heel and stomped upstairs. slamming her bedroom door so hard, the framed photographs in the hallway rattled against the wall. The rest of the afternoon passed in a suffocating haze of anxiety. I spent hours scrubbing the floor, the smell of vinegar and tomato sauce burning my nose. The tension in the house was a living, breathing thing. It pressed down on my chest, making every breath feel shallow and restricted. When dinner time arrived, the psychological warfare shifted into a new, terrifying gear. I walked into the cramped kitchen to find Brittany standing over the ancient gas stove. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the room, a cruel comfort in the hostile environment. Eleanor was already sitting at the small wooden table, staring blankly at a placemat. I reached for a plate from the cupboard. Brittany slammed the cabinet door shut, missing my fingers by a fraction of an inch. She looked at me with cold disgust and stated that she only cooked for family. She served 2 plates, placing one in front of her mother and taking the other for herself. She sat down and began cutting her meat, the metal knife scraping loudly against the cheap ceramic. I stood there, humiliated, my stomach twisting with hunger and rage. I looked at Eleanor, hoping for just a shred of basic human decency. But the older woman kept her head down, chewing slowly, pretending I did not exist. Then, Brittany initiated the next phase of her attack. She casually wiped her mouth with a napkin and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She looked at her mother and spoke in a soft, wounded tone. She said she had been meaning to bring something up, something that was deeply upsetting her. Brittany claimed that $50 had gone missing from her vanity drawer. She said she had left 2 $20 bills and a 10 right next to her makeup brushes that morning. And now they were gone. Eleanor stopped eating. Her cloudy eyes widened as she looked across the table at her daughter. Brittany did not look at me. She kept her gaze entirely fixed on the old woman. She whispered that she hated to make accusations, but only one other person had been upstairs all day. The implication hung in the heavy, grease-scented air. It was a masterclass in manipulation. I stepped forward, my voice rising as I furiously denied the accusation. I told Eleanor it was a complete lie, a staged performance to poison her against me, but Eleanor just stared at me. The doubt was already taking root in her tired mind. She had always chosen the path of least resistance, and right now, believing her daughter was easier than facing the truth. Eleanor pushed her plate away. She mumbled that she had lost her appetite, stood up, and shuffled out of the kitchen without making eye contact with me. Brittany smiled around a mouthful of food. She had won the battle perfectly. She had successfully fractured the fragile trust between me and my mother-in-law. That night, I lay awake on the lumpy mattress in the tiny spare bedroom. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against my closed eyelids. My mind raced, returning again and again to that dropped piece of paper, the notary stamp, the massive sums of money, the sheer panic in Brittany's eyes when she ripped it from my hands. I knew I could not wait for David to return. I had to find out what she was planning, or I would be out on the street with nothing. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. I waited until I heard the front door open and close. I peeked out the window and saw Brittany walking briskly down the cracked sidewalk, heading toward the corner store. This was my only window of opportunity. Driven by a desperate, clawing paranoia, I crept down the hallway toward her bedroom. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, wincing as the old hinges let out a high-pitched squeal. The room smelled overpowering. It was a suffocating mix of cheap floral perfume and stale cigarette smoke. Clothes were thrown over every available surface. I moved quickly, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I checked the vanity drawer first, finding nothing but tangled jewelry and expired makeup. I dropped to my knees and checked under the bed. Dust bunnies clung to my damp palms as I reached into the darkness. My fingers brushed against smooth, rigid cardboard. I pulled it out. It was a thick manila folder, unmarked and heavily worn at the edges. I opened it on the faded carpet. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents with the letterhead of a local real estate agency. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs. The words seemed to blur together before finally snapping into sharp seam 0 plus. Horrifying focus. It was a preliminary appraisal for the rowhouse. Attached to it were property tax records, and a bizarrely detailed breakdown of closing costs. Why would Brittany have an appraisal for a house she did not own? She had absolutely no legal right to sell the property. I flipped to the next page. It was an email printout from a man named Greg, a real estate agent. The message was brief, urging Brittany to finalize the signatures so they could push the rapid sale through the gray market. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. She was actually trying to sell the house right out from under us. Before I could dig deeper, the heavy thud of the front door closing echoed up the stairs. Panic seized my throat. I shoved the papers back into the folder, kicked it blindly under the bed, and sprinted silently out of the room. I made it to the bathroom and turned on the faucet just as Brittany's heavy footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I splashed cold water on my burning face, trying to regulate my ragged breathing. An hour later, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, startling sound that cut through the tense silence of the afternoon. I was in the kitchen, closer to the front of the house. I walked out and opened the heavy wooden door. A courier stood on the stoop, wiping sweat from his forehead. He held a thick cardboard envelope tightly against his chest. He asked for Eleanor. I told him she was resting, and offered to sign for the package. He hesitated, looking at a clipboard in his hand. He mumbled that it was from the real estate agency and required a direct signature. My blood ran cold. The agency. The same one from the folder under the bed. I lied smoothly, forcing a calm smile. I told him I was her daughter, and that I handled all of her legal correspondence due to her poor eyesight. He shrugged. I handed me the electronic pad and let me scribble a messy signature. He handed over the thick package and walked away down the concrete steps. I closed the door and leaned against it. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. The return address printed in the corner confirmed it was from Greg the realtor. Just as I slid my finger under the cardboard flap to tear it open, a hand clamped down on my wrist like a steel vise. Brittany had sneaked up behind me. Her grip was agonizing, her acrylic nails digging viciously into my skin. She yanked the package out of my grasp with bone-jarring force. Her face was flushed dark red with absolute, unrestrained fury. She backed me up against the door, pressing her forearm into my collarbone. She physically threatened me, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying growl. She told me that if I ever intercepted her mail again, she would throw me down the concrete cellar stairs and tell the police I tripped. I shoved her back, breaking her hold on my neck. I yelled that I knew what she was doing. I told her I knew about the appraisal, and that she could never sell the house without David's signature. She laughed in my face. It was a deeply disturbing sound, completely devoid of fear. She stepped back and smoothed down her shirt. She looked at me with smug, unshakable confidence, and claimed that David knew everything. She said her brother was completely on board with her plan, and that they were just waiting for the right time to kick me to the curb. I knew it was a lie. David loved this house. He had promised his dying father he would never let it leave the family. But the sheer conviction in her voice planted a tiny, agonizing seed of doubt in my mind. The next morning, the sound of grinding metal woke me from a restless sleep. I walked downstairs to find a man in dirty work clothes standing in the open doorway. He was holding a heavy power drill. Wood shavings were scattered across the welcome mat. Brittany stood next to him, her arms crossed, watching him work. I asked what was happening. The man did not look up. He just kept drilling into the heavy oak door. Brittany turned her head slowly. She smiled and casually informed me that the neighborhood was getting dangerous. She had hired a locksmith to change the front deadbolt. I watched in horror as the man removed the old brass lock and slid a heavy, industrial-grade mechanism into the door. He handed Brittany 2 shiny new silver keys. She slipped one into her pocket and held the other one up to the light. Admiring it, she walked over to Eleanor, who was sitting in her worn recliner in the living room, and gently placed the second key into her mother's frail hand. I held my breath, waiting for her to hand me a spare. Brittany looked at me, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. She dropped her hand to her side and simply stated that squatter tenants did not get keys. She told me that if I left the house, I better hope someone was home to let me back in, because she was officially locking me out. The physical boundaries of my prison had just been finalized. The climax of the week arrived on a humid Friday afternoon. The mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes through the brass slot in the front door. They scattered across the floorboards. Brittany was in the shower. The water pipes rattled loudly in the walls. I knelt down and quickly sorted through the pile. Bills. Junk mail. A grocery circular. And then, at the very bottom, a pristine white envelope. It was from a major national bank. It was addressed directly to Eleanor. I held it up to the dim hallway light. The envelope had a translucent plastic window. Through the frosted film, a bold line of text was clearly visible. It read, "Home equity line of credit application," firmly followed by the word, "Approved." My heart stopped beating. A home equity line of credit. A massive loan taken out against the value of the house. Eleanor had not worked in 20 years. She could never qualify for a loan like that. Someone had forged her financials. Someone had taken on massive debt using the house as collateral. A sharp gasp echoed behind me. Brittany stood at the bottom of the stairs. A damp towel wrapped around her head. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged at me. She tackled me to the floor. Her wet knees slamming into my ribs. She violently ripped the envelope from my fingers, tearing the paper in half. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the torn pieces against her chest. Breathing like a cornered animal, she started screaming. The sound was deafening. Bouncing off the narrow walls, she yelled that I was a thief. Aspe. A parasite trying to steal her mother's money. The commotion was too much. The living room door creaked open. Eleanor stepped out into the hallway. She looked frail, confused, and utterly terrified by the screaming match. Brittany did not miss a beat. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. Her voice cracked with fake, theatrical sobs as she told her mother that I was trying to destroy their family. The heavy silence that followed her accusation seemed to suck all the air out of that narrow hallway. I just stood there, staring at the translucent envelope crushed in her fist, realizing that defending myself to Eleanor right now was a completely losing battle. Eleanor leaned heavily against the doorframe. Her eyes darted between me and her daughter, searching for an anchor in the chaos. I slowly lowered my hands and took a step back, giving them the space they demanded. I told Eleanor, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I would go to my room and let them talk. I turned my back on Brittany's victorious smirk and walked down the creaking hallway. Every step felt like walking through wet cement. I closed my bedroom door and locked it. The small spare room felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in on me like the sides of a cardboard box. I sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the muffled voices echoing from the kitchen. Brittany was talking fast, her tone sharp and urgent, weaving a narrative that I could not hear but knew was full of poison. Hours passed. The sun set over South Philadelphia, casting long, bruised shadows across the aluminum siding of the houses across the alley. The streetlights flickered on, buzzing with a dull electrical hum that vibrated through the thin window pane. The house grew completely still. It must have been 2 a.m. when I heard the floorboards groan right outside my door. It was a slow, shuffling wait. A soft, hesitant knock tapped against the wood. It was so quiet I almost thought it was the house settling. I slipped off the bed and pressed my ear to the door. I heard the shallow, nervous breathing of my mother-in-law. I turned the deadbolt as quietly as I could and eased the door open. Eleanor stood there in her faded flannel nightgown, clutching her hands together so tightly her knuckles were entirely white. Her face looked 10 years older than it had that morning. She looked past me, into the dark room, and asked if she could come in for a minute. I pulled the door wider and guided her to the small chair by my sewing table. I sat back on the edge of the bed, waiting for her to speak. She stared at her hands for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swimming with unshed tears. She whispered that she could not sleep. She said that something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. In the pit of her stomach. I kept my voice low and steady. I asked her what Brittany had told her in the kitchen. Eleanor swallowed hard. She said Brittany told her the bank letter was just a confirmation for the property tax relief forms they had filed last month. She said Brittany had assured her it was a state program for widows. But Eleanor was not stupid. Just tired. And she said she remembered the word on the envelope I had read aloud. She asked me what a home equity line of credit was. The question hung in the air. Heavy and suffocating, I leaned forward and took her trembling hands in mine. I explained it as simply and gently as I could. I told her that a home equity line of credit is a massive loan. I explained that someone had used the house, the very roof over our heads, as collateral to borrow tens of thousands of dollars from the bank. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She shook her head, whispering that it was impossible, that the house was paid off decades ago by her late husband. She said David and Brittany owned it 50-50 now. She said she had never signed any loan papers. I squeezed her hands and asked her to think back to the property tax forms Brittany had given her to sign. I asked her exactly what they looked like. A tear spilled over Eleanor's wrinkled cheek. She described a thick stack of papers with sticky notes pointing to the signature lines. She admitted she did not have her reading glasses. She said Brittany had seemed in such a rush, complaining that the deadline was that very afternoon. The absolute cruelty of it washed over me. Brittany had leveraged her own mother's blind trust to mortgage the family home out from under us. Eleanor began to cry silently, her shoulders shaking with the weight of the betrayal. She asked me what they were going to do. I told her we were going to stop it. But I warned her that I needed her to be incredibly brave. And more importantly, I needed her to pretend she knew nothing. I explained that if Brittany suspected we were onto her, she would accelerate her plans and possibly lock us out before David got home from his trucking route. Eleanor nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her nightgown. A new emotion was settling over her fragile frame. It was not just fear anymore. It was the quiet, devastating heartbreak of a mother realizing her child was a monster. She stood up, her posture a little straighter than before. She promised me she would act completely normal. And then she slipped out of my room, disappearing back down the dark hallway. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights, formulating a plan to trap a predator. By morning, the claustrophobic air in the house was thick with unspoken tension. I waited until I heard the shower running in the upstairs bathroom before I made my move. I knew Brittany had a strict morning routine. She would come downstairs exactly 20 minutes after her shower, pour a cup of black coffee, and sit at the kitchen island to scroll through her phone. I walked into the kitchen and set my phone flat on the counter, right next to the fruit bowl. I opened the voice memo app and pressed the red record button. I placed a dish towel casually over the phone, leaving just the microphone exposed. Then, I started making breakfast, the smell of sizzling bacon filling the small room. Right on schedule. The stairs creaked. Brittany walked into the kitchen, wrapped in her silk robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me cooking. She crossed her arms and asked me why I was still here, reminding me that I had less than 13 days to pack my garbage and leave. I kept my back to her, turning the bacon with a fork. I kept my voice perfectly flat, perfectly submissive. I told her I had nowhere to go. I asked her what would happen if I simply refused to leave the house. Brittany let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She walked over to the coffee pot and poured herself a mug. She leaned against the counter, just 3 feet away from the hidden microphone. She told me that if I did not leave voluntarily, she would have the sheriff physically drag me out the front door. She said she had all the legal authority she needed. I turned around to face her, keeping my expression entirely defeated. I asked her how she had the authority when David owned half the house. Brittany took a slow sip of her coffee. The victory was too sweet for her to keep entirely to herself. Narcissists can never resist an audience. She smiled, a cold, dead expression, and told me that David's half was about to be liquidated. She bragged that she had a power of attorney document being finalized right now. She said it was amazing what a willing notary and a desperate real estate agent could accomplish. I widened my eyes, playing the terrified victim. I asked her about Eleanor, asking how she could trick her own mother into signing a loan against the house. Brittany rolled her eyes and set her mug down. She called her mother a clueless old bat who would sign a confession to a murder if someone put a yellow sticky note on it. She proudly admitted that the home equity line of credit was just the first phase. She said the money was paying for her new condos downtown, and the forced sale of this miserable row house would cover the rest. Then, just to twist the knife, she brought up the money. She leaned in close and whispered that planting that $50 in my room was the easiest thing she had ever done. She laughed again, saying her mother was so desperate for peace, she believed the lie immediately. Brittany looked me up and down with absolute disgust. She told me I was nothing but a squatter, a pathetic parasite who thought she could marry into property. She promised me I would be homeless by the end of the week. I looked down at the floor, letting the silence stretch out. I waited a full 5 seconds to make sure the recording captured the natural pause. Then, I turned off the stove. I told her I would start packing. Brittany smirked, grabbed her coffee, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. The moment she was gone, I pulled the towel away and saved the audio file. I played back the last 10 seconds. Her venomous, bragging voice echoed from the phone speaker, loud and crystal clear. I had the murder weapon. Now, I needed the accomplice. After Brittany left for her yoga class, I went straight to the garbage can in the alley behind the house. I put on a pair of rubber gloves and started digging. The smell of rotting food and stale beer was overwhelming in the humid morning air. I sifted through coffee grounds and junk mail until I found what I was looking for. It was a crumpled, glossy business card. Greg the realtor, specializing in rapid home sales. I took the card inside, washed my hands, and dialed the number. A Faust, overly enthusiastic voice answered on the second ring. I pitched my voice an octave higher and adopted a hurried, professional tone. I introduced myself as Sarah, Brittany's new personal assistant. I told Greg I was calling to confirm the timeline on the power of attorney paperwork for the property sale. Greg did not hesitate for a second. He let out a sleazy chuckle and said Brittany was really moving fast. He confirmed that the documents were stamped and ready to be filed with the county clerk on Monday morning. He casually mentioned that he found a notary willing to look the other way regarding David's physical absence. He said the buyer was lined up and the cash would be in escrow within 10 days. I thanked him, told him Brittany would call him later, and hung up. My hands were shaking. The sheer scale of the fraud was staggering. They were days away from stealing David's inheritance and leaving Eleanor with a massive debt on a sold house. The trap was fully set. All I needed now was the man of the house. David was not supposed to be back from his trucking route across the Appalachians for another 4 days. But fate, for the first time in months, was on my side. It was late afternoon on a Thursday. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light through the living room windows. Brittany was lounging on the sofa, painting her nails. Eleanor was in her armchair, silently knitting, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on her needles. I was in the kitchen, pretending to clean the stove. Then, the whole house began to vibrate. It was a deep, rhythmic rumble that rattled the teacups in the cabinets. A massive shadow blocked out the light from the front window. The sharp hiss of air brakes echoed down the narrow street. My heart leaped into my throat. The front door unlocked, and the heavy deadbolt clicked open. David walked in. He looked exhausted. His work boots were scuffed. His jeans were stained with diesel grease, and his shoulders slumped with the weight of thousands of highway miles. He dropped his heavy canvas duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a loud thud. He looked around the room, offering a tired smile. Before I could even take a step toward him, Brittany sprang from the sofa. She practically threw herself at her brother, wrapping her arms around him in a theatrical hug. She immediately started crying. It was the same fake, trembling sob she had used on her mother 2 days ago. She buried her face in his flannel shirt and cried out that she was so glad he was home. She sobbed that things had been completely out of control. David looked confused, his arms awkwardly patting her back. He looked over her shoulder at me, his brow furrowed in concern. Brittany stepped back, wiping away her artificial tears. She pointed an accusing finger at me and launched into her rehearsed monologue. She told David that I had been stealing from them. She claimed I had terrorized their mother and refused to pay for groceries. She said I was completely unhinged and that she had to change the locks just to feel safe in her own home. She looked at Eleanor, expecting her usual silent complicity. But Eleanor did not look away this time. She kept her eyes on her knitting needles. Her jaw set in a rigid line. David's face darkened. He was a protective man. And the idea of his family being torn apart while he was on the road deeply disturbed him. He looked at me. His voice rough and heavy. He asked me what the hell was going on. I walked slowly out of the kitchen and into the living room. I did not look at Brittany. I looked directly into my husband's eyes. I told him I missed him. And I told him he needed to sit down. Brittany scoffed loudly, crossing her arms. She told David not to listen to my lies, insisting that I was trying to manipulate him. I ignored her completely. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and set it down on the solid oak coffee table. I tapped the play button on the voice memo. I turned the volume all the way up. The audio started with the hiss of frying bacon. Then, Brittany's arrogant, sneering voice filled the living room. The acoustic shock of hearing her own voice bragging about the fraud hit the room like a physical blow. The recording played her calling Eleanor a clueless old bat. It played her gleeful admission of faking the stolen $50. And then, it played the critical piece. Her voice echoed through the speaker, bragging about the forged power of attorney. It played her detailed plan to liquidate David's half of the house and pocket the cash from the home equity line of credit. The recording ended with the quiet sizzle of the stove. The silence that followed in the living room was absolute and terrifying. Brittany's face had drained of all color. She looked like she had just stepped in front of a speeding freight train. She stammered, taking a step backward. She tried to say it was artificial intelligence, that it was a fake recording I had made on a computer. David did not look at her. He stood up slowly. He was a big man, built by years of hauling heavy cargo and changing massive truck tires. When he was angry, the air around him seemed to grow freezing cold. He looked down at his mother. He asked Eleanor, in a voice that was barely a whisper, if she had signed bank papers for Brittany. Eleanor finally looked up. Tears were streaming down her face. But her voice was surprisingly strong. She said yes. She said Brittany told her it was for property taxes. But it was a lie. David slowly turned his head to look at his sister. Brittany backed up against the wall, her eyes wide with genuine panic. She raised her hands, babbling that it was just a business loan, that she was going to pay them all back, that they were a family. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at me and asked for the realtor's name. I handed him the crumpled business card. David dialed the number and put the call on speakerphone. Greg answered on the first ring. Using his usual overly cheerful greeting, David did not introduce himself. His voice was like grinding gravel. He told Greg he was David, the co-owner of the property on South 12th Street. Greg fell dead silent on the other end of the line. The enthusiasm evaporated instantly. David told the realtor that he was standing in his living room, completely aware of the forged power of attorney. He stated very clearly that he had never signed anything and had never been in the presence of a notary. He told Greg that if the home equity line of credit was not canceled by 5 o'clock, and if the property listing was not pulled immediately, his next call would be to the district attorney for felony real estate fraud. Greg stuttered, his voice jumping an octave in sheer terror. He swore he had no idea the documents were forged, claiming Brittany had assured him everything was legal. Greg practically shouted that he would cancel the deal right now, begging David not to involve the police. The line went dead. David slowly put his phone back in his pocket. He turned his attention back to Brittany. She was trembling now, sliding along the wall toward the staircase. She tried to say his name, trying to summon the sibling bond she had just tried to sell for cash. David pointed a thick, calloused finger at the front door. He did not yell. He did not scream. The absolute calm in his voice was the most terrifying thing of all. He told her she had exactly 1 hour to put her life into garbage bags. Brittany gasped, tears of real shock pouring down her face. She asked where she was supposed to go. David replied that he did not care. He told her if she was still in this house in 61 minutes, he would drag her out by her hair and throw her onto the sidewalk. He turned his back on her and walked into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed rage. Brittany looked at her mother, begging for help. Eleanor picked up her knitting needles, looked back down at her yarn, and completely ignored her daughter. The spell was broken. The gaslighting was over. For the next 50 minutes, the house was filled with the frantic sounds of crashing hangers and slamming drawers. Brittany ran up and down the stairs, stuffing her expensive clothes and designer shoes into heavy-duty black trash bags. No one helped her. No one spoke to her. Exactly 59 minutes later, she dragged the last bag out onto the front stoop. She stood in the doorway, looking back into the house with a mixture of hatred and profound disbelief. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a venom that would never truly go away. I just stared back, my face entirely blank, refusing to give her a single ounce of emotional reaction. David stepped into the hallway and slammed the heavy oak door directly in her face. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final hecho. The suffocating pressure that had lived in that house for years instantly vanished. Eleanor let out a long, braided, shuddering breath, as if she had been holding it for a decade. David walked over to me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. He buried his face in my hair and apologized over and over again. I held him tight, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The war was over, and the house was finally ours. 6 months later, the claustrophobic brick rowhouse in South Philadelphia felt like a distant memory. The home equity line of credit had been successfully canceled before any funds were dispersed. The bank investigated the notary, who quickly lost their license. With the threat of fraud gone, David and I decided to take out a legitimate, small loan against the house. We used it to fund a dream I had kept locked away in that tiny spare bedroom. I stood behind the polished mahogany counter of my new tailoring boutique downtown. The front window let in massive amounts of natural sunlight, illuminating the racks of custom-made garments. The business was booming. The affluent professionals in the city center paid a premium for meticulously tailored clothes, and my appointment book was completely full. The little bell above the glass front door chimed. I did not look up immediately. Carefully pinning the hem of a silk evening gown, I called out a warm greeting, saying I would be right with them. When I finally stood up and wiped the chalk from my hands, I froze. Standing near the entrance was Brittany. She looked entirely different. The arrogant posture and the expensive designer clothes were gone. She was wearing a faded winter coat, and her hair was tied back in a messy, uneven ponytail. She looked exhausted, pale, and deeply humbled by the harsh reality of the world outside her mother's house. She stood near the rack of winter coats, shifting her weight nervously from foot to foot. She could not meet my eyes. I walked slowly out from behind the counter. I did not smile, but I did not glare either. I simply existed in my own space, a space I owned completely. Brittany swallowed hard, clutching a worn-out purse to her chest. She spoke in a voice so quiet I almost could not hear her over the sound of the traffic outside. She said she had heard about the shop. She said she had been living on a friend's couch for 3 months, but they had kicked her out. She looked down at her scuffed boots. She admitted she had no money, no credit, and no references. She took a ragged breath and asked if I needed someone to sweep the floors or organize the fabric inventory. She was begging. I stood there, looking at the woman who had tried to throw me out onto the street. I looked at the woman who had tried to steal my husband's inheritance and bankrupt her own mother. I could have laughed. I could have screamed at her to get out of my store. But revenge is a chaotic emotion, and I had no room for chaos in my life anymore. I preferred absolute, undeniable control. I pointed to a small wooden stool in the back corner of the shop. Next to a mountain of raw fabric bolts, I looked her dead in the eye, stripping away every ounce of the power dynamic she used to hold over me. I told her to sit down. I told her she was on a 2-week trial period, paying minimum wage. And then, with a calm, unshakable certainty, I told her that I make the rules here. Brittany nodded silently, tears welling in her eyes, and walked to the back of the shop to sit exactly where I told her to. I turned my back on her and went back to the silk gown, the morning sun warming my hands.